Hello there.
Hi. Welcome to From Skirts to Scrubs. I'm Alicia.
And I'm Charlotte.
And we are two residents trying to figure out our place in medicine by looking to the past and to current events to better understand the impact they have on us as women in medicine, as OBGYNs, and women in general.
Yeah, and you can find or follow us on social media. We have Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, which are all at From Skirts to Scrubs. We also have a Twitter, which is at FSTS_podcast. And we also have a YouTube channel that we post on now as well. You can watch us record our episodes. And then we also have a website where we have more information on all of our episodes. We have our show notes on there, our sources, and more at FromSkirtsToScrubs.com.
Yeah. You can also subscribe to our podcast and leave us a rating and review. And Apple Podcasts is the best place for that, but you can also do it on Spotify and other locations.
Yeah, and welcome back to episode 62, which is wild. This is actually the end of our season. It's our fifth season. So it's the end of the fifth season, which is wild. It's a little bit shorter season than we usually do, but that's because we literally just started residency. And so, we're doing what we can. But we're very excited for this episode. This one has been very highly anticipated. Maybe not from your end as listeners, even if you're a diehard listener, but definitely from our end in terms of planning. We've been meaning to do this episode for ages. And so this ended up just being perfect time to talk about this. And it might not be a topic that's extremely relevant to the lay person, but it's very integral to every medical student. And it comes with a very interesting history. And that is the history of human dissection, which I know is kind of a lot to take on because dissecting a frog in high school is already a lot for some people. And the idea of doing that to a human is unimaginable. And until you've done it, which, is only done under supervised educational settings at this point. I'm not encouraging anyone to become a Dexter out there. But until you've done it, it's really hard to understand and grasp what it really means and what it is. So today I want to talk about the history of human dissection, how women are involved in this history, and a little bit about modern human anatomy courses. So before we get into it, Alicia, do you have any thoughts, knowledge, pearls of wisdom you'd like to share?
I'll just say the things that are coming to mind. It's giving grave robbing. It's giving Da Vinci.
Mm-hmm.
It's giving butchers. I don't know. That. Those are kind
of honestly, those are things that we will talk about. You are hitting good points, and I think you'll also be very surprised by other things because I was surprised too.
Here's the sad thing is I don't know anything about the way that women have impacted this area. So that'll be fun.
It's very niche. We'll get to it. It's very niche. That was just why this episode has taken so long to get where it is today, because it was a lot to research, but it's really cool. So let's just get into it.
Let's do it.
Nice. All right. So to start, let's clarify. When I'm talking about human dissection, which is just such a weird phrase to say, but that's essentially what it is. We're going to say it. It happens in various contexts of why are we opening the human body after death? And the reason for why these dissections happened, I think, is critical to understanding the history because there's a lot of different components of why we are dissecting a person and not an animal or whatever, to understand anatomy. And so, taking a human body and dissecting it, it takes purpose and something. Wait, what was I trying to say today? Okay. So yeah, there's often a very specific reason you want to do this because unless you're Dexter and you are a serial killer psychopath, you're not just opening bodies for funsies. It's done in a very directed way. That's, for a reason. And some of these reasons we're going to talk about today are funeral rites, the creation of spiritual relics, autopsy, and the advancement of anatomical knowledge.
Use your hands less. You're clapping into the microphone. Yeah, exactly. Literally like that. I'm
hand talker. It's so hard.
I know, which is fine, but do it here or something. Do it somewhere else.
Okay. Anyway. All right. So we're going to start with funeral rites as the first reason that people dissected other people in history. And we're starting at the OG place for funeral rites. So drum roll,
Egypt?
please. It is Egypt, yes. My drum roll was interrupted.
Sorry.
Yeah, of Egypt, of course, where we start so many of our histories. Egypt is so well known for their practice of mummification and embalming. Mummification was a part of the Egyptian religion with beliefs that it would allow the body to live on within the afterlife. And for whatever reason, I feel like very connected to this topic specifically, like Egyptian mummification. Because I don't know if it was just me, but I learned so much about like Egyptian history and mummification in elementary school.
Me too, dude. I
Maybe this
love
explains
mummies.
so much about
like,
us.
I love mummies, but I was also terrified of them. Like, I would be
Yes.
so into those documentaries on random like the History Channel, but then I'd also have nightmares. So,
oh my god, about being mummified?
No, just of the mummies. Like, I don't know.
Like the scare when mummies are being scary. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It just really stuck with me like throughout my life, and is one of the reasons I wanted to study classical history in college, which led to where we are now today. But basically, in the process of embalming a person in their mummification, you would remove all the organs in their abdomen, pelvis, and chest, meaning out goes the stomach, the uterus, the lungs, the intestines, the spleen, pretty much everything. They would leave the heart, though. That was left in the body, but most everything else was taken out, including the brain, which this is the thing that like really got me as a child that I was like obsessed with. I thought it was crazy. That they would remove the brain through the nose with a very long metal hook. And they would just like pick out the brain piece by piece so they wouldn't have to like cut open the person's head. So that's just wild. It's still wild to me that you can reach your brain through your nose. It seems like too close for comfort. But oh well, that's just how it is. But seriously, like all these organs were removed. And it's not like they just chucked them in the trash or something like that, or like moved on with the mummification. They, of course, are humans and were curious as human beings are. And so this led to a lot of inspection of these organs, and a lot of care was given to specific ones. So, like if you know a lot about mummification, there's 4 jars that different organs are put into, and they're very famous. You can look them up. They're in like a lot of museums and everywhere across the world, honestly. And these would hold the stomach in one, the lungs in another, the small intestine in another one, and then the liver. And all of these jars were adorned with the 4 sons of the god Horus for protection of these like vital organs. And while
what were they called again?
I don't know. Each of them have like a very specific name, but it's like the literal sons of God, like the god Horus. Oh. And I don't know. They're very long and ancient Egyptian names that I don't know. But they're cool. You should like, they're like, one's a jackal head and one's this. Like, they're like animal heads, which is how a lot of Egyptian gods are portrayed, with like people with animal heads. Mm-hmm. So they would put those organs in there. And then in general, there were like other organs, obviously, they removed. And while the dissection of the body for the mummification was not done in the context of like an anatomical learning or education, it did inherently contribute to the field of knowledge of anatomy. Because as we know, there are so many medical papyri, whatever the plural of papyrus is. Papyruses, I don't know. There are so many, like one of the oldest texts on gynecology is from Egypt, and these go very in depth with Egyptian medicine, but they offer terms about organs and anatomical structures in them, where they like compare animal anatomy to human anatomy. And it's not like there's a specific anatomical text, but they do mention different structures that you wouldn't be able to really know unless you saw it inside of a person. So that just naturally came with the embalming of like that deceased individual, allowing this circumstance to be like one of the first instances of human dissection in history, which is really interesting. So while embalming was done as part of a funeral, moving on to what was done in like the holy community. And Alicia, have you ever heard of like relics being made, or like what a relic is?
Yes.
Like a relic
I feel
of
like
a saint?
We've talked about them maybe. Actually, I don't know. Maybe Were they like,
don't know if we
no,
have
I was thinking of amulets. Ignore me. Keep going. I don't know what a
different.
relic is.
Yeah. A relic is like an artifact that has a piece of a person inside of them. So usually it's like a saint or a well-loved pope
yes.
or like something
I
like that
saw some of
where
these in like Europe when I went.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
in
exactly.
Budapest, they keep some weird, like the toe of one of their patron saints. It's
yeah,
interesting.
and then you like people like worship the relic as
Yes.
being like part of their saint. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's exactly what I'm talking about. So it's this kind of crazy but common thing that happened in medieval Italy. And basically, when a holy person would die, they would be taken apart, and sometimes not in the most like clean or respectful ways, honestly, to put like parts of that person into a relic, into an artifact, make it into a relic, so that people would come, donate money, worship, like fund, the Catholic Church and other churches that have these relics, because people would travel to come and see them and worship these saints.
Dang.
And this happened for a long time, and it occurred in a lot of holy men, but it also occurred in holy women, which is where women kind of come into this equation. So I read this book that I've had on my bookshelf for 5 years that I read for this episode. It's called Secrets of Women, Gender, Generation, and the Origins of Human Dissection. It's by Catherine Park. And it is, when I say that women in human dissection is niche, it is like the only source on this material. Like if you search the internet, everything just is like quoting this book or like referencing this book, which is why I read it, and which is why it's taken a while to get to this episode, because it's hefty. And it's basically a textbook on how women are involved in human dissection and a lot of like things we've already talked about in this podcast, just like different ideas of women in history and how women's health was perceived, which I'll tie in a little bit. But basically, in this book, she discusses in length the death of a couple nuns and a couple of like women who were considered holy in medieval Italy. And first was the nun Chiara of Montefalco, who died in 1333. And this nun was known to be a visionary and, for example, like not powers, but in the same way like saints have miracles, she would have miracles and like visions of people and things that would happen in people's lives. She even was like really ill for a super long time before she died. And then right before she died, she all of a sudden got better and was like all good and happy. And then she died. And so people were like, wow, that's incredible. And so after she died, the sisters in the nunhood, I guess is what they're called. I don't know if brotherhood and nunhood are similar, but the sisters of her nunhood, who would already embalm like other sisters who had died, decided that while they were embalming her, they were going to create relics from her organs. And so this one is cool because it's an example of women doing dissection and like women being involved in the embalming process, which I think traditionally in Egyptian embalming is usually women as well, just because they found that women were more respectful of the deceased bodies. But in this instance, the nuns were doing the embalming of their sister. And while they were doing it, they got a little curious and opened up her heart. They literally like took her heart and opened it. And inside they found a cross-like image, which, who knows what it could have been. But an image in her heart that looked like literally the cross, like Jesus on the cross.
I mean, I could kind of see it because the heart has 4 chambers. So if you just cut it in half, you would kind of.
And if like her cross, if like the septum in the middle was like really thickened for some reason, then it would be like a thick cross.
Middle,
like it wouldn't just be like thin. Anyway, so they saw that and they were like, wow, she's literally like a holy saint. Like she has a cross in her heart. Like how much more pure could you be? And they made this into this holy relic. And there's accounts of people like one man prayed to it and then his leg was cured. One man like doubted that it was real and then he like broke his arm or something shortly after. Like they truly believed like this heart had powers, and it's still preserved and you can still see it like in Europe. Like it's still a relic that you can go and see. And then they also found, while looking in her gallbladder, like these nuns are really just looking around.
They
looking
were.
looking in the gallbladder. They found balls in the gallbladder.
Well, yeah,
which,
she probably had gallstones. Like,
exactly.
who cares?
So they literally called a doctor in and was like, yo, what is this? And it was gallstones. And those gallstones are also in a relic. There's like a relic of like a cross, and there's a gallstone at each edge like of the cross.
So weird.
Yeah, relics are crazy. They're really, really something. But it's so interesting. So they were like making these relics, but also kind of like dissecting and analyzing her anatomy. Wild. And then a similar story occurred for another holy woman at the time named Margarita, solid name, who was known for her miracles. She was a blind woman and like also performed many miracles. And after her death and during the embalming, they also looked at her heart and they found 4 stones in her heart. And these stones were in the shape of Mother Mary, baby Jesus, Joseph, and the Holy Spirit.
What?
Yes. So I don't know if there's like a stone in each chamber of the heart, but they had all this like really religious imagery in it. And so they were like, wow, that's crazy. And what's interesting about these nuns, like being almost basically dissected, not quite just embalming. And what Catherine points out in her books, The Secrets of Women, is that these stories about like the dissection of someone during the embalming is really just holy women, and there's not really accounts of like the holy men. Like the men would be made into relics or embalmed, but there wasn't like all this discourse about, oh, their heart looked like this, their lungs look like, it just like was done and that was the end of it. But now we're having like a lot more inspection into these women after their death. And like, why do you think this is, Alicia?
I just feel like maybe women, they be curious. Like, I don't know. I think in my head, I'm like, oh, they just take a lot of care when they're doing this embalming. And so they inspect each.
Yeah, sure. Another thing is, well, I will say that the second woman, Margarita, was dissected by men. So the first one was with women, the second one was men. And basically what this book argues is that these women, these holy women, were being dissected more intentionally after their death because of the distrust of powerful women at the time. So holy women, like,
what? I don't know if I understood the question.
Yes, I'll explain.
Okay.
I'll explain. Holy women like were powerful. They were often virgin women who lived in their own communities with other women. They did not have to rely on men throughout their life. They lived on their own outside of common society and without men, which was very uncommon in medieval Italy. And then on top of it, these women would perform miracles and have visions from God. And so part of them being dissected was what this book argued is them looking like distrusting these women, like trying to prove that they were actually crazy and not having visions from God and not like these powerful holy women. There was almost a way to like try and discredit them, which didn't work for the two nuns, because they did find things inside the body that for them verified that they were holy women and like should be. The first nun, like they tried to make her become a saint. She went through like all of the trials or whatever that you go through to become a saint, and she didn't end up actually getting to sainthood, but like she was close and a lot of people worshipped her, and like still like her relics are available still. And so they were basically looking inside of these nuns' bodies after death as a way to prove or disprove the power that they held in life. So that's the theory of like why more of the holy women were dissected versus like holy men, as a way to like prove that they actually were powerful and able to do these miracles and like have these visions from God. And I don't know, for me that feels a lot more like a violation compared to like the Egyptian embalming process was a lot more of like an honor for the deceased person. Like they were cherishing their life and moving on to the afterlife. And then in this instance with the embalming, they're kind of like exploring the inside of this person's body in a way that's almost violating in my head.
Yeah.
They're like looking to, solve their own curiosities.
Or it's honestly, it's giving like pointing fingers. It's being like, I'm going to try to find a reason to distrust you.
Exactly. Especially after their death too, which is so rude. Like the person can't even defend themselves anymore.
No, there's really no need.
Yeah. And so the idea of mistrust of women is not exactly like an uncommon idea here on this podcast. Like we've talked about how throughout history, women's bodies were topics of confusion, speculation, and distrust, especially from the perspective of men towards women. Men could not understand, for one, why a woman could create a baby and they couldn't. And like, where the heck did even babies come from, which we have a whole episode on. And they thought menstrual blood was dirty. Like the uterus was such a mystery to them, and they hated it. They hated that women somehow knew more about their own bodies than they knew about women's bodies. And so their anatomy was also a mystery to them. And this leads into the next area of discussion that was discussed in Catherine's book, The Secrets of Women, which is the domestic autopsy. And you're probably like, what does that mean? What the heck is a domestic autopsy? But she really discusses at length as well what this practice was in the 13th and 14th centuries, where husbands and families could call on a doctor after the death of a female family member to do an autopsy in the home of that family member. And
what? For what reason?
Exactly. So we'll start with one woman, Famida di Donato, who died in 1477, shortly after the birth of her 7th child. And supposedly, her husband was so heartbroken by her death, even though he got remarried 1 month later, apparently. He was so heartbroken by her death that he called on a physician to come to their home and perform an autopsy, where they found that her uterus was full of blood. So in my mind, I'm like, does she have a postpartum hemorrhage and that's why she died or something, if she died after childbirth? But basically, this kind of opened the doors to being able to dissect people. It wasn't always women, but like being able to dissect women in the field of medicine, because now we have like physicians doing autopsies and dissecting people. And we haven't gotten to this next point, but we will. But like at this time, a lot of human dissection, which was occurring at this later part of the 13th, 14th century, it was mostly of men. Like very heavily only men being dissected, or probably like 99%, which we'll discuss in a bit why. So this domestic autopsy made it available to dissect women as well. And so we finally got to study women. And since it was done in like a small private way within the home, the practice actually showed a lot more respect to like women's bodies, because they were able to like done it in private space and there wasn't people like watching the dissection or things like that. It was like truly just the family and the physician. And then also it was done in a way that the family could still bury the family member who had died in like within their funeral practices. But this also like, so that's the good side of it. But I feel like the flip side is that these female bodies were being dissected as a part of like private practice. And it came to a point that there are texts written on the anatomy specifically learned in this setting. So it kind of became like part of a physician's practice to go to homes and dissect these bodies per request of family members. And like, it's not like they had to be like, oh, sorry, like this random reason is why. They could just be like, oh, my wife died and I want to know like what's going on inside her body. Can you dissect her? And they'd be like, yeah, sure. And so that part's weird, because like they're being dissected without their permission after death, and it's like fueling this anatomical learning. I don't know. It's kind of weird. And doctors are very eager to learn something, because now they can actually like uncover the secrets of the womb, because they can't do that otherwise in anatomy and like in dissections. So that part's crazy, is that's how women like were starting to be dissected and how they learned a lot about the uterus and different female anatomies.
Dang, that's crazy. I had no idea that was happening.
Me neither.
I've never heard about that. Never.
So the nuns and the domestic autopsies are so niche in like how women fall into a lot of this human dissection history, which is so crazy, and never knew that before this week. Literally crazy. But all of the like aforementioned practices are very interesting, obviously, because I held this belief personally, for someone who like is really interested in medical history. I had this belief for so long that dissection was considered taboo and therefore led to like almost a delay in anatomical knowledge in the medical field. I saw that coming on and I was like,
I know. I tried to mute myself, but I couldn't. Okay.
It's okay. But we know from this discussion that there's actually multiple other ways that throughout history the field of anatomy grew, and that it basically grew on the shoulders of women who were dissected behind closed doors in a way that like we isn't talked about and like we don't know that much about, but definitely was key to a lot of anatomy knowledge throughout history that we don't really like discuss as much. So after centuries of human dissection being publicly taboo and occurring very infrequently, which is why all that other stuff was behind closed doors. Suddenly, in like the 1300s, Italy, full public display of human dissection like grew in popularity, meaning that the deceased would be dissected in anatomy theater, as they were called, in front of crowds, usually men, to teach them anatomy. A lot of anatomical knowledge throughout history, such as Leonardo da Vinci's anatomical drawings, which are based on 30 different human dissections.
Yeah.
Crazy. Were acquired through this practice of public dissections and anatomy theater lectures that began to be incorporated into Italian medical schools at the time, and then slowly like other medical schools throughout the world. But it's actually really, I don't need to talk that much about like this is what they learned in this part of no, I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about kind of like the really painful part of this history and who was being dissected in these like public anatomy lectures, basically. Because there's actually legal by law, not illegal, literally legal, that the bodies of criminals could be dissected in these anatomy lectures.
Yeah.
And so many of these dissections were done without dignity for the body, hence the public display. So it was not done in a private setting where the body had like privacy. And it was allowed due to the nature of this person's death, aka like they were sentenced as a criminal, to be not given some like respect of their body, and they were just kind of doing whatever they wanted to them in front of crowds of people.
I hate that.
Which is so sad, because no matter what kind of life you lived, who you are, every human's body should be shown dignity in life and in death. And as medical schools began to incorporate human dissection into the curriculum throughout the 14th and 16th century in Europe, and then eventually, you know, like the United States and everywhere else, the crime by the medical community really grew like crazy. And this is kind of what Alicia was mentioning earlier. It's just wild things were helping. One really famous story is of two men, William Burke and William Hare, who would actually go out in the streets of London and murder people and then bring their bodies to this doctor named Dr. Knox, and he would study them for anatomy in the 1800s in London, which is wild. Medical students would also rob graves in the night so that they could bring them to their anatomy labs to be able to study in their classes. And medical students would even stalk funerals, like just creep on funerals, so that after the funeral, they could grave rob the bodies and take them to class. It's just really terrible stuff.
It's horrible.
As the practice moved into the 1800s and 1900s, many bodies that were dissected in anatomy labs were bodies that were found in like workhouses and poorhouses and whorehouses and things like that, where no one was looking for those bodies. They would just be taken to these schools. And then when these places started to close in like the 1900s and late 1800s, a lot of unclaimed bodies from asylums and mental institutions would actually be sent to medical schools and hospitals to be dissected as well. And then to really add on to the pile of terrible, honestly, slave owners would sell the bodies of enslaved people for dissection. And in the 20th century, the bodies of Holocaust victims were often used for anatomical study. Yeah, which is heavy. Like I said, this episode can be heavy. The history is truly awful, and I cannot emphasize this enough. I don't think any memorial or medical field apology or podcast episode bringing light to this history will ever be truly enough to like understand the level of pain that was inflicted on these people who were used by the medical field rather than helped by them. Which is why I briefly want to talk about, to end this episode, I want to talk about anatomy lab today in medical schools, because, you know, for centuries now, anatomy lab is a class in medical school where you dissect human beings, and like it still happens today. So since all those terrible things have happened in the last few centuries, there has been now laws passed so that this cannot happen again to people. The Uniform Anatomical Gift Act of 1964 stated that the terms of a body donation is property of the donor. So, like, basically, the only person who can decide to donate their body is yourself. So, when you die, your parents, your siblings, your significant other, whoever, like, cannot make the decision that you get to be donated to science. You have to make that decision before you die. And that's part of this act. And the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act also has put a lot of work into campaigning, feels like the wrong word, but just like letting people understand what it means to donate your body to science, making sure people are educated on that decision. And if they do decide to make that decision, that they understand it and their families understand it. And then they are able to, be dissected in medical school anatomy classes or whatever anatomy classes there are. And then that body can then be given back to the family for an appropriate funeral. And so this is all part of this act. So it's done in a very ethically way. So all cadavers dissected today, which cadavers are like humans, those are people who chose this path for their body in their death. So with that, I want to talk about like our own anatomy lab experience. And Alicia can add on her own like experiences as well. But I know for myself how it went is in our first year of medical school, which of course was COVID, so it was a little weird. But there was a group of 6, and we were all assigned to one individual for the majority of the course that we would like one cadaver we'd be dissecting on. When you meet the body, essentially, we learned what their age, their sex, and their cause of death. We also started our anatomy course like as a whole with our professor reading a letter from a family member who had a family member donate their body, basically, that said like what it meant for that person to donate their body and to contribute to like future medical providers like learning anatomy from them, which was very touching and made it like it humanized it so much and made it very real and also very terrifying. Like as a first year medical student, like you're just starting off in this field. Now you're standing in front of a cadaver and it's like your first patient essentially. And it's a person who lived a whole life and now you're seeing the results of their life within their body. And that's really like unique and special. And some groups chose to like name the body because we don't get their actual names as a way to like pay them respect throughout the course. So you had something to call them. And I remember that first day, like personally so clearly, and someone had to make the first like cut to start the anatomy lab. And that was like me. I like made the first cut on our body, which was crazy. And I still remember it today. And I just want to say that like after saying how terrible the history of human dissection is, and there was some parts that were very respectful and some parts that were not respectful whatsoever. But my experience in anatomy lab was that it is a very like there's so much respect and honor in the dissection that you're doing from the very first time you do it to the last. Like every single step, the patient, this cadaver is given, their body is respected and how they're positioned. The language used to describe the cadaver is very respectful. And for myself, I thought it was such an amazing experience. And I was like so honored to be able to do it. And especially now as a resident training to be a surgeon, like the fund of knowledge that I felt like I personally learned from being able to have the anatomy like in my hand and walk myself through it in such a controlled and educational environment, like was really amazing. And so for me, I really enjoyed having an anatomy lab in medical school, but I know some people like feel like it's not needed anymore. So I don't know what your experience was, Alicia, but I think I would love to hear about it. And I think our listeners would too.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really fascinating, just long-term history. And I think personally, like, of course, our anatomy experience was so different than typical medical students because of COVID. And so I think we had a group of maybe 8 who were assigned.
Yeah, yours
to
was a little different, I remember.
Cadaver, but we would not ever come in at the same time. It was like socially distanced. So I never did like a full dissection of a certain part. Like I would only do part of the dissection with my partner and then we would leave and the next group would come and like do more of the dissection. And so there were definitely times where I was doing more dissecting and times where I was just doing more identifying. All this to say, sure. I think the way that my school had typically done it was extremely respectful because from what I knew, have like a memorial service every year. And I think they started it back up, but it's essentially like a live memorial service for the medical students and the families of the deceased to come and like share that space together, and people would share stories and talk about their loved ones. And unfortunately, we did not get to have that. But I do think
we didn't get to have it either because of COVID.
That would have been like a very profound experience, I think. But I do remember my first day, it was just us like being in the presence of the cadaver. Like we did not touch her or anything. And I think we also got like her age and cause of death. And she, I know, had breast cancer. So she had like a port and you know, just like learning from her body even before we like dissected her was like a very touching experience. And I just think I did learn a lot from Cadaver Lab in general, in the sense that I think there's a lot of skills that like tangible skills that you learn from being an anatomy lab that now as a training surgeon is like very important. I will say it's funny because the first time I ever saw a pelvis or an abdomen was in a real surgery because
me too, because of COVID.
Because of COVID, we didn't have literally like pelvic anatomy, abdominal anatomy. It was all virtual for us. Like we did not do that dissection.
COVID,
so,
man.
like,
COVID
imagine my confusion rolling up to like an abdominal hysterectomy, being like, I have no idea. But I will say, in my last year of med school, we had a very involved OBGYN prep course. And during that prep course, we actually did have not full cadavers, but we had actually like pelvises of more like fresh cadavers, and learning from their bodies was actually probably one of the most helpful experiences I've ever had in going into the profession I'm going into, because I just actually I knew so much more as a fourth year medical student. And then knowing that and being able to apply it to exactly the thing that I'm going to be doing was really helpful.
Yeah. And it's like such a safe setting, because you don't want someone to like being in surgery the first time and that's your first time seeing the anatomy that you're operating on. And then if you don't understand the anatomy, that's where things can really go wrong in surgeries. And so, I think as like, for our perspectives as people who are like need to know anatomy so in depth, it's so helpful compared to, I feel like, people who are going into things that you don't need to know anatomy so as well. They're like, oh, anatomy lab, like whatever. I don't really use that knowledge anymore. So it's very much like just decide. It kind of depends on like, I feel like what you're going into, but I definitely feel like everyone's experience in anatomy lab was that they were like just really amazed by it and like very honored to be able to do it. And I also should have mentioned too that like the like medical schools in general having funerals and memorial services with the family was implemented like the late 1990s as a way to make it a more respectful practice and a way to like humanize the course and like what you're doing as well, which definitely so glad they did that. And like we missed out on it, but I've heard from other students like how impactful those like memorials are to be able to like say thank you to the bodies that you learned so much from, and also like see the families if they're comfortable and like tell them how much you appreciate like their family member doing that for the medical field, basically, which is really cool.
Yeah, I think when you're looking at it from the best point of view, that's definitely the case.
Yes.
And so we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. All right. And with that, we're going to end season 5, which is crazy. So we will see you all in a few months for our next season, and maybe we'll drop a couple surprise episodes in here and there if we get a second. But Alicia and I are going to be doing our gynecology surgery service, and then we're both on labor and delivery at the exact same time, which is why we're taking a little bit of a break. So in the meantime, go ahead, subscribe to us on whatever your favorite podcasting app is. Leave us a rating and review. Catch up on old episodes. We have so many episodes that before our next season comes out, you can probably listen to a lot of them. And
and you can follow us on social media and check out our website for more information on our show notes, sources, merch, and more. That's from skirtstoscrubs.com. And lastly, here is to the women who fought for us to be where we are today, and may we do the same for those who come after us.
Yeah. Bye, everybody. Thanks for listening.
See you next time.